My hand rested on the brass handle of the Fort Carson Officers Club meeting room door for exactly 3 seconds longer than necessary. Through the frosted glass, I could see the blurred shapes of my son's engagement party guests, their laughter filtering through like distant thunder. I straightened my collar, the same frayed polo shirt I'd worn to work at the Veterans Center that morning, and pushed the door open. The conversations didn't stop, but they shifted. I felt the weight of their eyes, that microsecond assessment that travels from my worn Timberland boots up to my graying beard and back down again. My son, James, looked up from his conversation with his fiance's family, and I saw something flicker across his face. Not quite embarrassment, not quite pride. Somewhere uncomfortable in between. "Dad," he said, standing up too quickly. The chair scraped against the hardwood floor. "You made it." I nodded, scanning the room. The Caldwell family had taken over the far corner like they owned it. In a way, they did. Richard Caldwell had paid for this venue, these catered appetizers, the champagne fountain gurgling away in the corner like a monument to excess. He stood at the center of his family constellation, broad-shouldered in his tailored suit, a Rolex catching the afternoon light every time he gestured with his hands, which was often. "James," I said quietly, placing my hand on my son's shoulder. He was 32, a mechanical engineer, and the best thing I'd ever contributed to this world. "Good to see you, son." His fiancée, Melissa, stepped forward. She had her father's confidence, but her mother's grace, dark hair swept up in some intricate style that probably cost more than my monthly grocery bill. "Mr. Patterson," she said, her smile practiced and perfect. "I'm so glad you could make it." Before I could respond, Richard Caldwell's voice boomed across the room. "Well, well, the man of the hour." He strode toward me, hand extended, his smile too wide, too white. "David Patterson, right? Jim's told us so much about you." "James," my son corrected quietly. Richard didn't seem to hear. I shook his hand. His grip was designed to dominate, to establish hierarchy. I matched it exactly, no more, no less. 33 years in the Army teaches you when to push back and when to observe. "Call me Richard," he said, slapping me on the shoulder hard enough to make a point. Come, let me introduce you to everyone." He steered me toward his circle, where his wife, Patricia, sat with 2 other couples I didn't recognize. "Everyone, this is David. He's, Richard paused, his eyes scanning my attire again. "He works with veterans, right?" "I coordinate housing programs at the Colorado Springs Veterans Resource Center," I said evenly. Right. Government work." Richard's tone suggested I'd admitted to something slightly shameful. "Honorable stuff, of course. Not lucrative, but honorable." Patricia Caldwell smiled at me with the same practiced warmth as her daughter. "It must be so rewarding," she said, "the kind of thing people say when they can't imagine why anyone would choose a modest income." One of Richard's friends, a man with slicked back hair and an expensive watch that probably cost 6 months of my salary, leaned forward. "So you were in the military, Dave?" "Yes." "What branch?" "Army." "Oh, nice." He nodded, already losing interest. "My brother-in-law was in the National Guard for a few years. Mostly paperwork," he said. I said nothing. Richard filled the silence. "David's retired now. Taking it easy, right?" He winked at the group. "Can't blame him. All that structure and discipline for years. Must be nice to just relax." The word hung in the air like an insult wrapped in compliment paper. Dinner was served at long tables, arranged in a U-shape. I found my name card at the far end, near the kitchen doors. James was seated at the head table with Melissa and her family. He caught my eye across the room and mouthed an apology I pretended not to see. Throughout the meal, I listened. That's what 33 years in military intelligence taught me. To listen, to observe, to file away details that don't quite fit the pattern. Richard held court, telling stories about his business success. "Started with one shipping container 20 years ago," he proclaimed, gesturing with his champagne glass. "Now we've got warehouses in 3 states and partnerships all over the world: Ecuador, Panama, even some connections in Eastern Europe. His friends murmured appreciatively. I noticed the way he glossed over specifics, the way his hand moved to his phone whenever someone asked too many questions about logistics. The key to import-export, Richard continued, is knowing which regulations are really regulations and which ones are just suggestions. He laughed at his own joke. Several people joined him. I didn't. After dinner, Richard stood to give a toast. He was 3 glasses deep into champagne, his face flushed, his volume increasing. To James and Melissa, he began, raising his glass. My daughter is marrying a fine young man, smart, educated, a real engineer. He paused, his eyes finding me across the room. And he comes from humble beginnings, from a family that understands the value of hard work and simple living. The room quieted. James's knuckles were white around his water glass. I mean, look at David over there. Richard gestured toward me with his champagne flute, sloshing slightly. Perfect example of service to country. Spent his whole career following orders, living on a soldier's salary, and now He paused, searching for the word. Content. In his little apartment, doing his little job, wearing his. He looked down at my polo shirt, at the small coffee stain I'd noticed too late that morning. His comfortable clothes. A few people laughed nervously. Patricia put her hand on Richard's arm, a subtle warning he ignored. No shame in that, Richard continued, his tone making clear he thought there was plenty of shame in it. Not everyone is built for the business world. Some people are just meant to take orders, to serve, to exist modestly. And that's fine. The world needs soldiers. We also need people who are comfortable being, ordinary. I stood up. Not aggressively, not suddenly. Just stood, slowly, meeting Richard's eyes across the room. For a moment, something flickered in his expression, a brief uncertainty, like he'd poked something and wasn't sure if it would poke back. Thank you for the toast, I said, my voice carrying in the silence. And thank you for this party. It's generous of you to welcome James into your family. I walked out before anyone could respond, before James could follow, before I said something I might not regret. In the parking lot, I sat in my 15-year-old Honda Civic and made a phone call. General Martinez, I said when he answered. It's David Patterson. I know I said I was done asking favors, but I need one more. My apartment in Colorado Springs was small. A 1-bedroom, 3rd-floor walk-up with water stains on the ceiling and a radiator that clanked like it was angry about working. But it was mine, paid off. No debt, no complications. The walls were bare except for a few photographs. James as a boy in Little League, his mother before the cancer took her, a group photo from my unit in Iraq. I didn't hang my commendations, didn't display my service record. The Medal of Honor sat in a lockbox in my closet, wrapped in its original presentation case, alongside the citation that detailed the day in Fallujah when I'd pulled 3 wounded soldiers from a burning vehicle while under enemy fire. That was 18 years ago. It felt like 18 lifetimes. My laptop sat on the kitchen table, surrounded by notepads and a legal pad filled with notes. General Martinez had come through, sent me the preliminary file within 2 hours. Richard Caldwell's import-export business was called Caldwell Global Logistics. On paper, it looked legitimate. Proper business registration, tax filings, customs declarations. But I'd spent 33 years learning to read between the lines of paperwork. The shipping manifests showed a pattern. Containers from Ecuador arriving at the port of Long Beach every 6 to 8 weeks. Declared contents always vague. Industrial machinery parts, textile manufacturing equipment, agricultural processing components. The weights were wrong. Too heavy for the declared contents, but not heavy enough to be the full machinery the paperwork claimed. I pulled up the customs inspection records. Caldwell's containers were rarely inspected, maybe 1 in 20. That wasn't luck. That was arrangement. I made another call, this time to an old friend at the Defense Logistics Agency. Sarah, I said when she answered, I need you to run some names for me, quietly. 2 days later, James came to my apartment. He knocked 3 times, our old signal, and I let him in. "Dad," he said, not meeting my eyes. "About the engagement party. You don't need to apologize." "Yes, I do." He sat down heavily on my worn couch. Richard was drunk and out of line. Melissa was mortified. I should have said something. "Why didn't you?" He was quiet for a long moment. "Because I thought you couldn't defend yourself. Because I thought if I made a scene, it would just prove his point, that we were less than them." I sat across from him in the recliner I'd bought from a yard sale 6 years ago. "And you think we are?" "No. God, no, Dad. He ran his hands through his hair, a gesture he'd inherited from me. "They have so much, the house, the cars, the connections. And you and we've always just gotten by. I love Melissa, but sometimes when I'm with her family, I feel like I'm wearing the wrong costume to a party." "Son," I said carefully, "what do you know about Richard's business?" James frowned. "Import, export. He ships industrial equipment from South America and distributes it across the U.S. Why? Has he ever offered you a job?" "Yeah, actually. Last week. Said he could use someone with my engineering background to assess equipment quality. Decent pay, travel opportunities." James looked at me sharply. "Dad, what's going on?" I opened my laptop and turned it toward him. "I need you to see something." For the next hour, I walked James through what I'd found. The shell companies registered in the Cayman Islands, the suspicious shipping patterns, the customs officials who'd been flagged for accepting bribes but never prosecuted, the connections between Richard's business partners and known arms dealers in Eastern Europe. "This is?" James stared at the screen. "You think he's smuggling weapons?" "I think he's smuggling something more valuable than the industrial equipment he claims. Weapons, components, maybe. Or equipment that can be used to manufacture weapons. Small arms, parts that can be assembled after they're distributed. It's hard to track, easy to disguise, and extremely profitable." "How do you know all this?" "How did you?" James stopped, looking at me like he was seeing me for the first time. "What did you do in the army, exactly?" I'd been waiting 13 years for him to ask that question. Since he was 19, since I'd retired and moved to Colorado Springs and taken the job at the Veterans Center. He'd known I was a colonel, known I'd served in Iraq and Afghanistan, but he'd never asked for details. And I'd never volunteered them. "I was in military intelligence," I said quietly. "Counterterrorism, specifically. I tracked weapons smuggling networks that supplied insurgents in the Middle East. For 33 years, it was my job to find the patterns, follow the money, and shut down the people profiting from violence." James was very still. "The Medal of Honor," he said slowly. "You never talk about it. That was one day. The work I did after, that's what defined my career. I built cases that stopped weapons from reaching people who wanted to kill American soldiers. I closed the laptop. Richard Caldwell is the kind of person I spent 3 decades hunting." "You can't tell Melissa." James stood up, pacing. "She doesn't know. She can't know." "Son, no. Listen. She loves her father. This will destroy her. And the wedding is in 3 months. We've sent invitations. Her mother has been planning this for a year." He turned to me, desperate. "Can't you just let it go?" For me, the question hung between us like smoke from a fire neither of us wanted to acknowledge. "If you marry into this family," I said quietly, "you'll be connected to whatever happens when this business collapses. And it will collapse, James, with or without my involvement. These operations always do. Then maybe it's not as bad as you think. Maybe you're wrong. I'd been wrong once in 33 years. It cost a corporal his leg and nearly cost me my career." I didn't tell James that. Instead, I said, "I hope I am." He left without saying goodbye. I spent the next 2 weeks building the case. Called in favors from people I hadn't spoken to in years. An FBI agent I'd worked with in Baghdad reviewed the financial records. A former customs official I'd trained helped me trace the shipment routes. A retired ATF agent confirmed that several of Richard's business partners were under investigation for illegal arms trafficking. The picture that emerged was clear. Richard Caldwell had been smuggling weapons components from Ecuador for at least 8 years, using his legitimate import-export business as cover. He bribed customs officials, falsified paperwork, and distributed the components through a network of dealers across the Southwest. The profits were enormous. The body count from guns assembled from his parts was still being calculated. I compiled everything into a dossier and sent copies to the FBI, ATF, and a contact at the Department of Defense. Then I waited. The wedding invitation arrived in my mailbox on a Tuesday. Heavy cardstock, elegant script, Melissa and James's names embossed in gold. The venue was the Garden of the Gods Country Club, one of the most expensive locations in Colorado Springs. The reception was at 5 p.m. There would be 200 guests. My name was on the invitation. At the bottom, in smaller script, reserved seating for family of the groom. I RSVP'd yes. The week before the wedding, James called. "Dad, I need to tell you something." His voice was tight, controlled. I waited. Melissa and I had a long talk about her father, about the business. She didn't know, Dad. She swears she didn't know. He paused. But she doesn't believe you. She thinks you're jealous, that you're trying to sabotage the wedding because you don't think their family is good enough for me. The irony would have been funny if it weren't so painful. She asked me to uninvite you, James continued, but I told her no. You're my father. You'll be there. Another pause. But Dad, please, don't cause a scene. Just be there. Congratulate us, and let us be happy. Can you do that? I could hear the plea in his voice, the fear that I'd become the villain in his love story. I'll be there, I said. And son, I've never wanted anything but your happiness. After he hung up, I opened my closet and pulled out the garment bag I hadn't touched in 13 years. Inside was my army dress uniform, the blue fabric still pristine, the brass buttons still bright. The medals were in a separate box, rows of ribbons representing 3 decades of service, deployments, commendations. At the top, in its own velvet case, was the Medal of Honor. The day of the wedding, I arrived at the venue early. The Garden of the Gods stretched out behind the country club, red rock formations glowing in the late afternoon sun. It was the kind of place that charged $500 just to hold your ceremony there. I wore my dress uniform, every button polished, every crease sharp, every ribbon in its proper place. The Medal of Honor rested at my neck, the light blue ribbon standing out against the dark fabric. Guests stared as I walked through the parking lot. An older man in an Air Force jacket actually saluted. I returned it, feeling the muscle memory of 33 years snap to attention. Inside, the coordinator checking names looked up from her clipboard and froze. "Oh," she said softly, her eyes on the medal. "Welcome, sir. Right this way." She led me past the rows of white chairs, past the reserved family seating up front, to the very last row. "I think there's been a mistake," I said quietly. She consulted her clipboard. "David Patterson? Yes, you're listed here, in the back row." I looked toward the front, where Richard and Patricia Caldwell sat in the first row. Richard's business partners scattered among the prime seats. James stood at the altar with his best man, adjusting his tie nervously. He hadn't seen me yet. "That's fine," I told the coordinator. "I'll stand in the back." The ceremony was beautiful. Melissa looked stunning in her gown. James looked terrified and happy in equal measure. When the minister asked if anyone objected, the silence was broken only by nervous laughter. They were pronounced husband and wife. Everyone applauded. I stayed in the shadows at the back, watching my son kiss his new bride, knowing what was coming. The reception was held in the club's ballroom, round tables with white linens and centerpieces that probably cost more than my monthly rent. The wedding party was announced to applause. James and Melissa had their first dance. Richard gave a toast about family and new beginnings and the importance of choosing partners who would help you rise above your circumstances. When he said that, his eyes found me standing near the bar. He smiled, raised his glass in my direction, and drank. The FBI arrived during dinner. 3 agents in dark suits walked through the main entrance and approached Richard's table. I watched from across the room as Richard stood up, confused at first, then angry as one of the agents showed him a badge and spoke too quietly for anyone else to hear. The ballroom went silent in waves, conversations dying as people realized something was happening. Melissa stood up, her face pale. James reached for her hand. One of the agents spoke louder now, his voice carrying, "Richard Caldwell, you're under arrest for conspiracy to smuggle weapons components, wire fraud, bribery of federal officials, and violations of the Arms Export Control Act." Patricia screamed. Guests pulled out phones. Richard's face went from red to purple. "This is a mistake. I don't know what you're talking about. This is my daughter's wedding. For God's sake." The agent was already reading him his rights. That's when Richard saw me. Really saw me. The uniform, the medals, the way the agents glanced in my direction with brief nods of acknowledgement. "You," Richard said, his voice shaking with rage. "You did this. You pathetic, jealous." "Mr. Caldwell," one of the agents said sharply, "you have the right to remain silent. I'd suggest you use it." They led him out in handcuffs. Patricia followed, sobbing. Melissa stood frozen at her table, her wedding dress suddenly looking like a costume. James looked at me across the room, his expression unreadable. I walked over to them slowly. Guests parted like I was carrying something contagious. "Melissa," I said gently, "I'm sorry. I truly am." "Sorry?" Her voice was thin, stretched. "You just had my father arrested at my wedding. At my wedding. Your father has been smuggling weapons components for 8 years, components that were assembled into guns used in crimes across 6 states. I have the evidence. So does the FBI. So does the ATF. It's not a mistake, and it's not personal." "Not personal?" Melissa laughed, a sharp, broken sound. "You ruined my wedding day! You ruined everything!" "Your father ruined it," I said quietly, "when he chose to build his fortune on violence, when he chose to commit federal crimes. I just made sure the truth came out before James got pulled into the consequences." "James is already pulled into it," she screamed. "He's my husband. His name is now connected to this family." "That's why I did it now," I said. "Before he joined the business, before his name was on any paperwork, before he could be considered an accessory or a co-conspirator. I looked at James. I protected you. That's what fathers do." James's face was wet with tears. "You could have told me. You could have warned us. Would you have called off the wedding? Would she have believed me?" I gestured to the chaos around us, guests gathering their things, the wedding coordinator on the phone, probably calling lawyers. Sometimes the truth only means something when it arrives with badges and handcuffs. I started to leave, but James caught my arm. "The Medal of Honor," he said, looking at it for the first time. Really looking. "What did you do to earn it?" "I saved 3 lives in Fallujah. Almost lost my own." "And after? The rest of your career?" "I saved more lives. Different way. Built cases that kept weapons out of the wrong hands, that stopped money from flowing to terrorists, that prevented violence before it could happen." I met his eyes. "I did the same thing today. You could have just walked away. Let someone else handle it." "I could have," I admitted. "But then, what would I tell those 3 soldiers I pulled from that burning vehicle? That I only save lives when it's convenient? That I only fight evil when it doesn't affect my personal life?" James let go of my arm. Melissa was crying now, her mother on the phone, probably talking to lawyers. The beautiful reception was dissolving into chaos and accusations, and the kind of disaster that becomes family legend. "I love you, son," I said. "And I'm sorry your wedding day became this. But I'm not sorry for what I did." I walked out through the same doors the FBI had used, leaving behind the wreckage of a celebration that was built on foundations already crumbling. 3 weeks later, James knocked on my apartment door again. 3 times, our signal. I let him in. He looked older, tired. "Richard posted bail," he said without preamble. $2 million. He's under house arrest, pending trial." "I know. The FBI says the case is solid. He's looking at 20 years minimum. More, probably. Mandatory minimums for arms trafficking are severe." James nodded, looking around my small apartment like he was seeing it for the first time. Melissa moved back in with her mother. "We're taking some time, probably getting an annulment." "I'm sorry." "Are you?" There was no accusation in his voice, just genuine curiosity. I'm sorry you're hurting. I'm not sorry he's facing justice. James sat down on the couch, picked up one of my notepads, put it down. I've been thinking about what you said, about saving lives, and I realized I never asked you about them. Who? The 3 soldiers, from Fallujah. I went to my bedroom, opened the closet, pulled out the lockbox. Inside, under the Medal of Honor, was a photograph. 4 men in desert combat uniforms, arms around each other, grinning at the camera despite the dust and heat and danger. Corporal James Mitchell, I said, handing him the photo. He was 19, lost his left leg below the knee but survived. He's a teacher now in Ohio, has 2 kids. James stared at the photograph. Sergeant David Torres, I continued. He was 23, burns over 40% of his body. He's a physical therapist now, helps other burn victims. Married, 3 kids, dad, and Private First Class James Patterson. He was 18 years old. Your mother and I had just sent him his birthday care package the week before. James looked up sharply. You named me after my little brother. Yes. He survived Fallujah because I pulled him out of that vehicle. He died 3 years later in Kandahar. Different war, different fire. No one close enough to reach him in time. I took the photograph back, carefully, like it might dissolve. That's why I couldn't walk away from Richard Caldwell. Because every weapons shipment he facilitated, every gun component he smuggled, ended up in someone's hands. And those hands pulled triggers that killed people. Maybe soldiers, maybe civilians, maybe kids. James was crying again, silently. You've been carrying this for years, all of it. The deaths you couldn't prevent, the lives you did save, the brother I never knew existed. I carry it because it matters. Because if I stop caring about the connection between actions and consequences, then what was it all for? What did your uncle die for? What do those 3 soldiers live with every day? And Richard? He never thought about those consequences? Richard thought about profit. That's the difference between people who serve and people who take. We think about the cost. They think about the price. We sat in silence for a while, the afternoon light slanting through my small window, dust motes dancing in the air. The Veterans Center, James said finally. That's where you still serve, still save lives. Different battles, same war. Homelessness, addiction, suicide, unemployment. Those are just different enemies, different ways people get hurt. James picked up the photograph again, studied it. I want to know everything. About Uncle James, about your career, about all of it. Not the classified stuff, obviously, but who you really were. Who you are. Why now? Because I spent 32 years thinking I knew you, and I realized I only knew the parts you let me see. The tired father who worked long hours and never complained about money and wore the same clothes until they fell apart. I thought that was all there was. He looked at me, and I saw something new in his face. Respect, maybe, or understanding. I didn't know about the man who ran into fire. I didn't know about the man who spent 33 years stopping violence. I didn't know about the man who was willing to destroy his son's wedding day to keep his son from becoming an accessory to murder. I didn't destroy the wedding. Richard did, years ago, when he made his choices. I know that now. James stood up, walked to the window, looked out at the Colorado Springs skyline, modest compared to the cities he'd visited with Melissa's family. It's funny. Richard spent the whole engagement calling you ordinary, calling you simple, calling you a man who just took orders his whole life. He laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. And you're the most extraordinary person I know. You just never felt the need to announce it. That's not why I served. I know. That's what makes it extraordinary. He stayed for dinner, leftover meatloaf I'd made 2 days before, reheated in my small microwave. We ate off mismatched plates at my kitchen table, and he told me about Melissa, about how she'd finally looked at her father's business records, about how she'd broken down when she realized what her childhood home had been built on, what her education had been paid for with, what her wedding had almost celebrated. She asked me to tell you something, James said, pushing mashed potatoes around his plate. She said she understands why you did it. She doesn't forgive you yet, but she understands. That's more than I expected. She also said, he paused. She said she's glad someone loved me enough to risk losing me, that she hopes if she has kids someday, they have a father who would do the same thing. I didn't trust myself to speak. I was embarrassed by you, James said quietly. At the engagement party, at every event where you showed up in your old clothes, driving your old car, never quite fitting in with the Caldwells and their world, I thought you didn't try hard enough. I thought you'd settled for less. He looked at me, his eyes red. I'm sorry, Dad. I'm sorry I didn't defend you. I'm sorry I made you feel like you weren't enough. You were always more than enough. You were everything. I reached across the table and gripped his hand. You don't apologize to me for being human, for wanting your father to impress people, for wanting to fit into your new family. That's normal, James. That's okay. It's not okay that I was ashamed. You weren't ashamed of me. You were ashamed of yourself for not being as successful as them. There's a difference. I squeezed his hand once more and let go. And for the record, you're more successful than Richard Caldwell could ever be. You built your career honestly. You earned what you have. You don't need to look over your shoulder wondering when the FBI is coming. That's success, son. That's real wealth. We finished dinner. He helped me wash dishes in my tiny kitchen, and for the first time since he was 12 years old, it felt comfortable. No tension, no unspoken expectations, no gap between who I was and who he needed me to be. At the door, he hugged me. Not the brief, obligatory hug of recent years, but a real embrace, the kind that says something words can't quite reach. I love you, Dad, he said. The real you, the one who pulls people out of fires, even when the fire is a wedding and the people think they don't need saving. I love you too, son. After he left, I stood at my window and watched the sun set over Colorado Springs, painting the mountains in shades of gold and red. My phone buzzed with a text from General Martinez. Heard about the Caldwell case. Good work, David. You still got it. I didn't respond. I just stood there, thinking about choices and consequences, about fires you can see and fires you can't, about the difference between saving lives and saving face. The Medal of Honor sat on my kitchen table where I'd left it after showing James the photograph. In the fading light, the star at its center caught the last rays of sun, throwing a small constellation across my apartment wall. I picked it up, held it for a moment, remembering Fallujah, remembering my brother, remembering every choice I'd made since that day. Then I placed it back in its box, back in the lockbox, back in my closet where it belonged, not hidden, but not displayed, not a trophy, but a reminder. Some fires you run into, some you prevent, some you watch burn because they were lit long ago with fuel you can't extinguish. The only thing you control is whether you tried, whether you acted, whether you stood up when it would have been easier to sit down and look away. I'd spent 33 years in uniform and 13 years out of it, and the mission was always the same: protect people from the violence others would profit from. Sometimes that meant pulling them from burning vehicles. Sometimes that meant exposing the people who sold the weapons that caused the fires in the first place. Richard Caldwell would go to prison. The weapons pipeline he'd facilitated would be shut down. Lives would be saved that would never know they'd been in danger. And my son would build his life on honest ground, free from the weight of his father-in-law's crimes. That was enough. That was always enough. I turned off the lights in my small apartment and went to bed. The Colorado night settling in around me like a familiar uniform, worn but still fitting perfectly, still serving its purpose, still ready for whatever tomorrow required. Some people measure success in houses and cars and watches that cost more than other people make in a year. Some people measure it in lives saved, children protected, violence prevented, truth told, regardless of cost. I'd chosen my measurement system 33 years ago. I'd never once regretted it, and I never would.